The argument in learning from Las Vegas was you could understand post-war America in the last half of the 20th century by understanding Vegas. In 1947, the population of Las Vegas was 4,500. Venturi's argument is that Las Vegas is tied to automobile culture and the automobile culture. And what he says is that if you look at Vegas and you go down the strip, the architecture as such is inconsequential. Because all the casinos and hotels at that time were set way back from the road because they were big parking lots where all the cars had to be parked. It was all about the signs. The buildings were concrete, were cinder block structures to hold up the signs. It was all about signs, and that's something about communication, right? So it wasn't stripping away of the sign. It wasn't about the purity of structure. And what he said of Mies, he said, look, you talk about the purity of structure, non-ornamentation. That pure form is ornamental. It's just a different aesthetic. And indeed, that's true. Corbusier got all those forms from silos out in the Midwest. Right. So what he was saying is non-ornamental. Venturi says it's ornament all the way down. But he also, or they also, understood 1968, the relationship of these architectural principles to emerging media. 20th century communications technology, this is postmodern, as opposed to 19th century industrial technology. That's Mies. That's Kant. That's Mies, that's Gehry. That's Kant, that's Derrida. Too simple, but not distorted, it seems. I think that what we need, in certain ways, and now this will go back to some of the things that Bernard was saying yesterday, is something like a critique of prosthetic reason. Reason's always prosthetic. The prosthesis that is reason, however, is not simply technology. It's not simply technological, because all of these structures are interconnected and interrelated with other structures and networks. So that in order to understand any of this stuff, and this is reductive, you have to understand everything. So if you want to understand media technologies, you have to understand its relationship not only to the technological, but to the social, the economic, the political, the psychological, as Bernard was saying. You have to understand it in terms of what used to be called nature. Because increasingly we're understanding that chemical, physical, and biological processes are in fact information processes. But there's not a sharp distinction, right? And you have to understand it in relation to culture, whether it be philosophical art or religion. And all of these things interrelate and interconnect. So if we're going to develop not a critique of pure reason, because reason is not pure, it never was, but a critique of prosthetic reason, it has to be an expansive critique. The way in which we order the world is not hardwired, it's tied to the modes of production and reproduction in a given society. As the modes of production and reproduction change, the way in which you order the world changes. And I think, it was a longer story, the very physiological structure of the brain changes as well. So what if we think about a different search engine? This is the architecture for Google. Comes from one of Sergey's early diagrams of it, right? Different kind of architectural structure, different kind of search engine than Dewey Decimal System, huh? We'll come back to that. Again, remember the structure of the university as it flows from the. So what would it be like to try to imagine a university structured like Google's architecture, rather than Dewey Decimal or Kant's? It begins with something like this. Right? It's not hierarchical. It's not linear. Right? Everything's two-way. Everything's contextual. Right? And for some of you, some of those categories should be familiar. One way, two way. It's a post-industrial rather industrial. It's decentralized and non-hierarchical. It might be the way knowledge would be reconfigured in the network world. Fine. So that's sort of theoretical stuff. How do you put it into practice? How do you practice the theory? How do you put it into practice in terms of teaching and in terms of writing? And the very distinction between teaching and writing is eroding. And we'll talk about that. Example, which Joe referred. 1992, for reasons I've never understood, I had the idea of teaching a course using teleconferencing technology with Helsinki. Wonder of wonder, one of the students who was in that course is with us tonight. Not by plan, necessarily, but Ken Thomas. I think we decided, these are, I think we decided you're over here somewhere, right? I had this idea, and I called my friend, to whom Joe referred, Hesse. Hesse is a very interesting guy. Very, very big media presence in Finland. At the time that we did this course, he was the youngest professor of philosophy ever to have been tenured at the University of Helsinki, and the lead singer of the rock band that had a #1 hit in Helsinki. I had this idea, and the college wouldn't help us. We figured it all out. So we had to figure out how to do it ourselves. We did. Finnish Telecom was very, very helpful. They lent us their studio. This is the class in Finland, in the teleconferencing studio of Helsinki. Here, with the help of my wife, Vinny, who's head of information technology, we put this together ourselves with Susan Pace. And I saw in the class the other day, there's an amazing moment for us. Because the way this was set up, I mean, my vision was to have a full-size screen with life-size people. Eventually we got that at a teleconference. I taught another seminar a couple of years later with Australia, and then by that time, but all we had were 2 TVs, outgoing and incoming, so you could only see it. So sitting there that first day, throwing the switch and wondering, is it going to work? And all of a sudden, these people in Helsinki show up. At that time, no student, I think it's almost no student, had used email. So in the course of the semester, we all started emailing. Or actually, I didn't realize it until the other day. The students started emailing before the semester began. S and I emailed back and forth. And after the semester was over, we put those emails together in a book, in which was one of the first efforts in which I tried to integrate graphic design in the argument of the book. But the book was done before we did the graphic design. I called the course Imageologies. I thought I made up the words, like mythology is only images, until a few years later I was reading a Kundera novel, and Kundera has the term in one of his books. But the idea was to create a global classroom. And it was an extraordinary moment, I think, for all of us. Let me fast forward for a minute before I talk a little bit more about this. One of the things I most miss in the work that's going on in the university and the academy today is the sense of pleasure and play that comes from the free exercise of the imagination. Far too much of what goes on is driven by fear and anxiety. I understand the anxiety, but it's paralyzing. Remember what Nietzsche said of the Greeks. They were, he insisted, profound because they were so superficial. In The Gay Science, he writes, anyone who has looked deeply into the world may guess how much wisdom lies in the superficiality of men. The instinct that preserves them teaches them to be flighty, light, and false. It is a search for depth and profundity that is superficial, that is simplistically superficial, because it seeks a bottom line to which all can be reduced or returned, and lusts for a foundation that renders